I'm Jay Melugin, and I'm here on the front porch of Clifton Irick's home, and we've been discussing Pilot Point history. Clifton, tell me some more about Pilot Point.
Well, it's an interesting town, Jay. If you've been around 80 some odd years like I have, why, you see things that happen and you know of things that happened, and I had the opportunity to question some of the old timers that were born right after the Civil War, and I got their information about Pilot Point, and I found out that Pilot Point is really an interesting place to live.
Well, I agree with you, and I think learning it from you is one of the best ways to learn because you've actually lived the history.
Thank you, Jay.
The town square for the community of Pilot Point was laid out on Christmas Day in 1853 by James Pearson and G.W. Newcomb. The plat was registered in Denton County in March of 1854, and lots began to be sold. Subsequently, the city was incorporated twice, once in 1867 and once in 1906. Following the war between the states in 1866, the military occupation encouraged local incorporation. The eligible voters were the Union soldiers, the freed slaves, and the Union sympathizers known as scalawags. Confederate soldiers and officials were barred from voting. In 1874, when voting rights were restored to all citizens in Pilot Point, the incorporation was voted out. It wasn't until 1906 that it was reincorporated under its current form, and the fire department was organized, and R.T. Evans was elected as the first mayor of the community of Pilot Point.
The Pilot Point Boosters Club had served the city for many years as a civic club, but it was agreed that we'd probably be better off if we were a member of the Chamber of Commerce. So the Chamber of Commerce was organized in 1951. We had as its original directors Alvin Branham, Charlie Ballard, Clifton Irick, J. Earl Sells, J. L. Jennings, J.W. Crack Peel, Jeff Pettigo, Ms. Viola Tomlin, Lee Massey, and William Hilt Sr. In 1872, Dr. Franklin and Mr. Green and others chartered Franklin College. It graduated students up to a B.A. degree from the first grade on up. The bell from the bell tower was saved, and it's now on display here in Pilot Point. It closed about 10 years after the public schools were formed here in Pilot Point, being closed approximately 1900.
Many of these students pictured here left Franklin College in 1894 when the Pilot Point School District was formed. This picture of the first school was taken about 1895.
The first brick school in Pilot Point was built in the late 1800s. It faced Prairie Street between White and Grove. It was replaced in 1924 by another school, and Mr. Irick bought the bricks from this school and constructed his home on South Washington Street, which is now a daycare center. This is another view showing the front of the school, which faced Prairie Street here in Pilot Point. This is a picture of the girls' basketball team here in Pilot Point in 1902, and it is believed that Mr. G was the coach of that team. Mr. G was bank president. 1923 picture of the 5th grade, being the last year that classes were conducted in this school building. This is a picture of the school that was built in 1924, which was the pride of Pilot Point. You find the high school was on the top floor, the middle school was on the middle floor, and the grade school was on the lower floor. This building served the district well, but was torn down in 1972.
This photo is the class of 1927, one of the first classes to graduate from the new school. In this photo, you'll see R.W. Edelman, who was the grandson of one of the founders of Pilot Point.
This is a Pilot Point school picture taken in 1933. I'm in that picture. I'm in the front row, the second one from the left. This is the first lunchroom for the Pilot Point High School children, or school children. It was built on Prairie Street in 1949. It was constructed from the bus shed, and Finley Miller was a construction chief on it. Our African-American school building burnt here in 1946, And this building from Emerson Chapel was moved in for them to attend school. When this building was moved in, the first lunchroom that was ever in the Pilot Point Independent School District was in this building. This is a picture of the G School soon after it was completed in 1951. It was named for the G family because they donated land that the school was built on. This is a view of the St. Thomas Parochial School that was built in 1893 and stood until 1917. This building's where the Catholic students attended grade school up to the 8th grade, and then they transferred over to Pilot Point High School for their high school education. This is a picture of the second Catholic school, and it was moved from the current Catholic school location to the corner of Church and Washington Street. It was used for a grocery store and a chicken hatchery, and it was later converted into a home by David and Carol Doughty.
This is a picture of the Bloomfield School in its original location in the Bloomfield community west of Pilot Point. It was built in 1882 and closed in 1930. It spent a number of years at the University of North Texas after Lake Ray Roberts was flooded. It was restored in 2003 and is now currently a living history classroom for area 4th graders.
This is a picture of the Emerson Chapel School in 1899, which was located on the road northeast of Pilot Point that goes out to the Emerson Ranch. This school was later consolidated into the Pilot Point School District, and the building was moved in for the African American School in 1946. This is the Walling School, which is taken in March 1905. This school was northwest of Pilot Point, and it was later consolidated into the school system up there, and when those systems came into Pilot Point, Walling School also came into Pilot Point.
This is a picture of the Friendship School, a small community southeast of Pilot Point. It also was brought into the Pilot Point School District.
This is one of the first Boy Scout troops that was organized in Denton County. It was organized around 1916 by Mr. G., who was president of the bank. Irick Cottage was located on the west side of Wharton Street on the current location of the Pilot Point Dry Cleaners. It was a hotel catering to traveling salesmen. It burned in 1928. Times were very hard in this area in the early 1930s, and money was very hard to come by. We had a shot in the arm, though, as they discovered oil out on Clint Jacobs' farm, which is out northwest of Pilot Point. It's in the lake area now. They produced several wells. The well number 2 was probably the best producer, and this made it possible that they decided to build a gasoline refinery in Pilot Point, which was built at the corner of Broad and Dallas Streets. This gasoline refinery, they produced Pilot brand oil, Pilot brand kerosene, and also road asphalt oil. Later on, the oil was discovered in East Texas. It was so much easier to strike oil down there and much easier to find oil wells that most of the drillers pulled out of here and went to East Texas, and that left us kind of high and dry. The refinery operated for 3 or 4 years and then was closed up. Pilot Point had its own flour mill in the early days. It's called the Pilot Point Roller Mill. It was located directly in front of where the fire station is located now. It produced about 4 different brands of flour. Also, it shows a picture of my father-in-law, Homer Stevens, as he worked in that flour mill in the early days before he opened his own grocery store. In the early 1930s, 1932 to be exact, the flour mill was pretty well destroyed by fire, but it left the 2 large grain bins on the north end of it. Later, a grain elevator was built there to handle the grain as the farmers would bring it in, and they used the spur track that came up by the side of those tanks. Rocks that were in the mill were bought by Worth Harris, and he built his new home in the 400 block of South Jefferson Street here in Pilot Point, and the house still stands today from those rocks that were in the mill. Pilot Point was mostly an agricultural town, and the agricultural products basically were peanuts and cotton. This is a picture of my father, Travis Irick, as he worked with the street matters as they harvested peanuts each fall. Also, at that time, Pilot Point had a cotton oil mill, which was on West Broad Street, just west of the railroad tracks. It produced cottonseed meal and things of that nature. This cottonseed oil mill burnt in the early 1930s. Kimball Gin was a gin that's located where the city machine shop's located now, and it was one of the two gins that we had in Pilot Point that were very, very busy. The largest gin west of the Mississippi when it was built was the Cooper Sales gin, which is later called the Massey gin. The last picture shows after it was rebuilt in 1958 to a modern new gin by Lee Massey. There's always a prize to the one that brought in the first bale. This is a picture of C.E. Hudspeth, the gin manager, myself as mayor, Joe Spratt as he is handed a $50 check by Clyde Hale, president of the Chamber of Commerce. This is a view of the west side of the square in 1915, showing the Opera House on the first building on you as you look at the left. And then it shows the other buildings there, which were hardware stores, jewelry store, and a grocery store, and then showing the F&M Bank on the corner. And you notice that there's not many automobiles around at that time. It was mostly still horses and buggies. View looking from the water tower to the northwest, showing the roller mill in the left-hand corner, and then over to the right is the liver stable, and then looking back to the west you can see a few of the older homes that were in Pilot Point. First picture here is a picture of the city supply and service station in the early 1920s. It was one of the first places that worked on automobiles in that day and time. This is located at the corner of Church Street and Main Street. The second picture shows it as the first Ford dealership operated by Hugh Dunn in 1926. Later on, it was Alvin Branham's service station and repair shop, which he operated there for several years. Lee Massey used the same location to operate his first Ford dealership here in Pilot Point in the 1950s, and it still is the Ford dealership here in Pilot Point today that's changed hands several times. After that, it was Gene Barron's cabinet shop for a number of years, and the building was torn down in the late 1990s, and the two pillars, brick pillars, are the only thing that's still remaining there of the original building. Picture inside of the Stevens grocery store in the late 1940s, showing those gathered around the cash register. Left to right is Billy Mayer, Don Stevens, and George Salmon, and then Betty Stevens and Homer Stevens, the original founder. This store later moved over on the north side of the square and stayed there until it moved out in the shopping center to its present location of Stevens Grocery and Market. The Queen Theater was a place that we all looked forward to as kids, and where we could go and see a Gene Autry movie. It was operated by Mr. and Ms. Coleman, the father of Alfred Coleman. The theater was later operated by Alfred and Veda. It was a place here in town that we all looked forward to going to, and it was destroyed by our tornado in 1955, the front of it was. And it also damaged a lot of the other buildings in town. And I owned a white auto store at that time, and I was fortunate that my store faced north and the storm didn't do as much damage to it as it did those that faced west or east, because it came from the west. It happened about 4:30 in the morning, and we were all got up, and the storm woke us up, so we went uptown to see what happened, and this is what we found when we got to the town. Alan Vader also founded the Dairy Best in the early 50s, and it's still in operation. It's Buchanan's Cafe today. Andy's Feed Store was founded here in Pilot Point in the late 1930s on East Main Street in the Great Orion building. It later moved down to the Evi Blues Green building at the corner of Broad and Washington Street, where it supplied the farmers of this area with their food for their cattle and all other farm products that they might need. This store was destroyed by fire in the middle 1950s, but it was rebuilt by Andy and later was sold to the Chickasha Oil Company, who operated for a number of years. Wilbur Joyner was the manager for Chickasha. This building located on East Liberty Street was the original home of Lamar Whitley Cleaners. He moved there from over on the north of where the City Hall is now. When he built this building, he operated it for a number of years. In the early 1960s, he closed up and retired, and this building was purchased by Dr. Groff, Dr. Marion Groff Sr. He bought it, and he also bought his home on the corner. And he operated his doctor's office out here for several years until he moved out to the new addition out on the highway where Axtell Pharmacy is now. Pilot Point Square was a very busy place in the early days. All the people came to town and shopped around the square. Mr. Davenport operated a dry goods and Friday, and he went bankrupt, went to West Texas, came back, opened up the store on the east side of the square, and it grew into a chain of stores before Mr. Davenport died in 1933. He was the first old man that I ever worked for. I sold firecrackers for him in 1933 out of his store there on the east side of the square.
Mrs. Copenhaver's Necessity Shop was an icon on the square for many years, being moved to several different locations. Here you see her in Dolly's location, which is on the corner of the square. R.T. Evans Hardware operated here in the early 20th century. R.T. Evans was the first mayor of Pilot Point.
In 1930, a community building was built here due to the citizens of the town that got together and made donations and built the building for the community affairs that we might have. It also had the first indoor basketball court, you might say, that was in North Texas, and Pilot Point played all their basketball games and volleyball games inside of this building. In 1951, the present G School was built, and the high school started playing their basketball games there. Previous to that, they'd played them all in this building. This building fell in disrepair. The school pulled out of it after G School left it to the city, and the city did not keep it up, and it was torn down in 1980s. Telephones were fairly rare in the early days in Pilot Point, but this is a view of the 1915 telephone directory here in Pilot Point. If you'll notice, over inside the page, you'll find an ad from R.T. Evans Hardware and the Lime Gray Lumber Company. The back page is a complete page ad by the Farmers and Merchants Bank. The thing that you might notice that the houses, or those that had numbers in Pilot Point, there's only 4 that had their names that begin with A. And that's usually quite a number in most telephone directories, but as new as phones were, that's all that were in this directory. The picture that you see here is a picture of Ms. Doreen Opitz, Pilot Point's chief operator, and Ms. Florence Langley, her helper, in front of the old switchboard, which had been in service in Pilot Point since 1935, and this was located in Pat Rankin's building upstairs. That was the telephone office where they could look out over the square. This shows right before they discontinued the use of the magnetic switchboard and went to the service that they have now in 1955. In order to promote patriotism in 1916 with World War I in the horizon, the Congress decided it'd be good if the Liberty Bell could make a tour of the United States. And here's a picture of the Liberty Bell when it was in Pilot Point, December 1916, as it toured this part of the country. In 1880, same year that the railroad came through Pilot Point, a cannon factory was constructed down by the side of the railroad track. It was constructed for the purpose of canning pears, and they set out pear trees all around the area. After about 10 years, it was converted to an ice plant. It burned in 1932, and it's at the present location of the city lot on West Walcott and the railroad track. Claude Blue at his father-in-law's filling station and grocery store, Mr. Kilgo, at the corner of 1192 and Carl Gross Road now. It was the old Sanger Highway at that time, and at that turn there that you made to your right would be the road to Gainesville. This picture was taken in 1932. Mail carrier Jim Blue, the father of the previous slide, Claude Blue, that I showed, carried the mail from the post office on the west side of the square down to and met each train as it ran and delivered mail. He picked the mail up and delivered it back to the post office, and he was killed on this spot by a car in 1940 as he was unloading the mail. The Saturday drawing was something that we held in Pilot Point for many, many years to draw people to the square. Each merchant that contributed was eligible to cash the certificates that were drawn by the people at the drawing. And this was a great drawing card for many years and drew many people to trade in Pilot Point. M.B. and Dorothy Yarber worked for Mason Wallen on a grocery store in Pilot Point. In 1945, he sold that to the Yarbers, and this is a picture of M.B. in the late 1940s in front of his store. Dorothy worked in there with M.B., and after M.B. died many years later, why then she continued to operate the store for a few years and sold it in 1986 after 41 years of hard work in this store. Wayne Sharkey Ray opened his mobile station on East Liberty Street on August the 1st, 1948. He had purchased it from Jim Richardson, who had built it. After he became the consignee for the mobile gas company, he moved his book to the book plant, which is now on Scott Lane in North Washington, until his retirement in the mid-1970s. City Machine Shop in its original location shows Mike Amon and William Hiltz Sr. giving the three Hiltz boys a ride on the lift in the early 1930s. They're sitting on the running board of Otto Shaw's 1928 Chevrolet. This other picture shows George and Billy in front of the first location with their wrecker they later built across the street when the Kimball Gin was torn down. Leonard Elmore was always interested in the electronics, and in 1929, after attending a radio school, he opened up his radio shop. He also was the first one to have TV. In 1949, Leonard had a TV and set it in his show window. People would gather outside and watch it as he left it on at night and on holidays where people could gather. Nadine and I, the first television we ever saw, was up there looking through his window with a lot of other people at night. Nadine and I opened her white auto store on March 6, 1946, immediately after my 4 years in service. Nadine worked during my time in service, and we lived off of what money she made, and we saved my Army money to go in business with. We saved a total of $3,500. We bought $3,400 worth of merchandise, kept $100 for change, and bought our fixtures on the credit when we opened up our store. We operated for many years. It was very fun and very profitable to us. We sold it to Finley Miller on January the 1st, 1964, when I went into the bank. Lifelong friend and business associate Bill Davis and his daughter Janet Sue in our white auto store in 1957. I had a number of older type men that would come into the store and gather around and tell stories, and so they'd push my merchandise around and sit down on my counter. So I decided I would fix a place for them to gather. So I built benches out on the east side of the store, named it the Spit and Whittle Club. And we had a group of men that was there all the time, was discussing politics, discussing the weather, and they were usually pretty well on line with what was happening. They were really up to date. In 1953, I had a calendar made of the Spit and Whittle bench showing them, and I had calls from all over the United States for people to send that calendar because they were either knew the folks or they were kin to them. In 1967, Joe Neal Case was operating his station, and he decided he'd build him a new station across the street, what is now Johnny Joe's. Johnny Shawn took over the management and the ownership of this station at that time, operated it for many years. Here's a picture of Johnny Shawn with one of his longtime employees, Jackie Mills. When Highway 377 went around Pollock Point in the early 1960s, Henry Semmel decided it'd be a good time to build a nice restaurant. And he did. He built this one at the intersection of the Salina Highway and new Highway 377. He and his wife operated it for several years, and then they sold it to Tony Ettridge and his family, and they operated it for many years as a family ownership. This is an inside view of the Peters and Jones hardware store that was located on the west side of the square next to the theater. You'll notice on here that they stocked a lot of horse collars and things of that nature that was really in demand at that time. We had one of the largest stores in this area on the south side of the square. It was the H.M. Russell and Company dry goods store. In 1937, Mr. and Ms. Pullen came into Pollock Point, and they opened a store up in this building, and they also grew to be one of the largest dry goods stores in this area. Here's a picture of Mr. Pullen and Ms. Pullen, Ms. Squires, who worked for them, and their son Hood in their store. I worked for Mr. and Ms. Pullen from 1937 when they moved to Pollock Point for the next 4 years before I went into service. Ryan Motor Company was one of the first motor companies that we had here in Pollock Point in dealing in automobiles. He was a Ford dealer and also a Chevrolet dealer at different times. He had a very prosperous business, and his business was located east of where the City Hall is located today, across from the Post Signal building. Fire department was organized in 1906, and the first 4 years they fought it with buckets and brooms. In 1910, the first wheel fire apparatus was purchased, and it was stored in a tin building directly behind where the water tower is now, just to the west. In 1946, I joined the Pollock Point Fire Department. I enjoyed working with them, and I worked with them for over 20 years. Here's a fire at Hub Henderson's house. We have Billy Bridges, Norma Jones, and Buster Woods. The car caught fire, and it caught the house on fire, and 28 Chevrolet, and they saved the house, but the car was destroyed. In 1960, we were invited to the Denton County Fair Parade, and we carried our T-model Ford fire truck down there. Paul Ray, Buster Wood, Don Stevens, Billy Bridges, and myself carried it down and entered the parade in Denton. We had an arson problem while I was mayor in the early 1960s. So in 1963, we passed a new ordinance on arson, and there's a picture of what was posted around the different places in town. Here's a group of Pollock Point horsemen in the early 1900s. They were on South Washington Street, where Buchanan's Cafe is now located. This is a view of the 1934 livestock show on the south side of the square in Pollock Point. And in the background on the right, you can see the Kemp Cafe or City Cafe, and then you can see the Bruce Run grocery store. You can see the Clore Cafe and the hotel, which was later the top floor was taken off, and is the building where the washteria is now. Another view of the Pollock Point Square, showing the Keith's Cash Store, and it also shows another picture of the hotel on the right that was a Clore Cafe and hotel. This picture is taken from the Clore Hotel balcony, looking to the north over the town square, showing the wagons and vehicles and things that were on the square, and the noticeable absence of automobiles, which was before their time.
Early motorists show off their cars on the north side of the square in 1924. In the background you'll see the First State Bank, one of 3 banks that operated in Pollock Point.
Gracie's ranch consisted of several hundred acres out east of town, but the Gracie home place was here in Pollock Point, located where the library is located now. This was a beautiful home, outstanding type home, but it was torn down in the early 1960s to make room for the Pollock Point National Bank. This is a view of the G home looking to the north. It shows the house. It was a beautiful home. It's the home of Mr. G, who founded the Pilot Point National Bank. All the G's had left Pilot Point and left it in care of a caretaker, and he cared very good care of the place down through the years. In 1942, the city boys were burning the leaves in the ditches, and they caught the cedar trees on fire, and they spread just like gasoline up and set the house on fire. Burnt this house and burnt Dr. Rogers's home on Liberty Street, and all 17 structures were burnt. This land was later donated by the G family to the Pilot Point Independent School District with the understanding that they'd build a school there. And G School was built in 1951, some 8-10 years after this home burnt. In the early days of Pilot Point, we had 3 Autry brothers that owned blacksmith shops here in Pilot Point. The last blacksmith shop we had in town was owned by the Autrys, was owned by Johnny Autry, a son of one of the original men that owned the blacksmith shop. It was located at East Main and North Church Street. This is a view of Johnny working inside the shop. The shop was torn down in the early 1960s when Johnny retired. Pilot Point had 5 saloons in its heyday. This is the last saloon that operated. It's called the Midway Saloon, and it was located where the City Hall is located now. Pilot Point Post Office, when it was located on North Jefferson Street, north of where the City Hall is now, but on part of the same property that's owned by the city. W.R. Pierce owned a second-hand store on the west side of the square in about 1915. W.R. was the father of Charlie Pierce, one of the original 12 firemen that we had here in Pilot Point. Later, Charlie Pierce owned a hamburger place on the north side of the square in Pilot Point. Inside view of the Star Drugstore, about 1867, in the wooden building. L.Z. Edelman, the first non-Indian child born in the city of Pilot Point, his picture is shown in this with others. As it appeared in 1872 in the new brick building built from John Hunley bricks that were manufactured here in Pilot Point. Dr. R.W. Edelman and his sister, Mrs. Alexander Cook, are in the picture. The current location of this drugstore is the building that's now occupied by Jay's Cafe here in Pilot Point. Cloher's store, located on the south side of the square in Pilot Point, just west of the Russell building, being also a dry goods store. It was started by Mr. John Cloher, who was also an auctioneer in Pilot Point. The present picture we see is the late 1950s when it was closed by Chester as he got married late in life and moved to Denton. W.E. Mountain grocery store in Pilot Point about 1909. Mr. Mountain was in 2 or 3 different locations in his business here in Pilot Point. After the automobiles became available, Mr. Mountain quit and went into the oil company and owned the W.E. Mountain Oil Company and was involved with his son Tom Mountain. Mr. Mountain was killed as he went after a load of gasoline in Grapevine one day on the Northwest Highway. His son Tom continued to operate the oil company here in Pilot Point until his death.
This photo of Pilot Point Bank was shown in 1884 with Mr. Asa Holt, the first president, on the right, and J.L. McFarland on the left. 40 years later, for their anniversary in 1924, this brochure produced showed Mr. Sells, Mr. Peel, and Mr. McFarland, the officers.
About 1900 to 1910, George Underwood Liver Stable operated the wagonette that met the trains as they pulled into Pilot Point, and they would haul the people from the depot up to the town square. It was driven by Earl McNatt, who worked for the liver stable and Mr. Underwood. This picture showing the northwest corner of the square prior to 1900 shows the residence being where the F&M Bank is located now. It was known as the Decker home. Sheriff Bill Decker of Dallas County lived there when he was a boy. Farmers and Merchants Bank was constructed in 1900 by the Light brothers for their own private bank. They operated this bank until 1929 when it consolidated with the Pilot Point National Bank. The building was built to also have offices for lawyers, dentists, and doctors in the above stores. A check from the Farmers and Merchants Bank, February 3, 1921, from W.J. Ford to J.W. Holmes for $7.45. Movies have been made here in Pilot Point of Bonnie and Clyde showing that they robbed the bank here, but that is not true. They never robbed a bank in Pilot Point. Pilot Point National Bank was robbed in February 1932. They came into town, kidnapped the night watchman, Mr. Montgomery. They cut all the fire alarms. They cut all the phone lines out of town. And then they made Mr. Montgomery carry him up to Mr. Sales' house, and he called out Mr. and Ms. Sales, and they went over to Mr. Peel's house, and they made Mr. Sales call out Mr. Peel and his wife, and they carried him back to the square. As the telephone operators saw that something was going on, but they were helpless on the north side of the square and could not get out of there to give the alarm because of the fact that they were being watched by bank robbers out with the ladies in the cars. Jack Clark worked at the bakery right behind the bank, came to work, and he got into the bakery and stayed in the bakery during the time of the robbery, but he couldn't come out either or they would get him. The bank robbers blew the safe right before daylight because Mr. Sales and Mr. Peel, neither one couldn't open it. It was a time lock deal. They left in a Model A Ford headed north, and they have never been seen since then because the crime was never solved. Several of the Holiness churches met in Pilot Point in 1908, and they formed the present-day Nazarene Church. My uncle and aunt, great-uncle and aunt, Uncle Allie and Aunt Emma, were two of the charter members of that group. They formed the Nazarene Church at that time. In 1958, they had their 50th anniversary here, and we had several thousand of them visited Pilot Point by special buses and by automobile that day. And we had a hard time really controlling the people because Pilot Point's not used to that much of a crowd. However, we fed their lunch catered by Jaton's Barbecue out of Fort Worth. In 1983, we had a 75th anniversary, and that coincided with the Nazarene Convention in Dallas, and they ran special buses up for 2 days, people that come up to visit the marker.
In 1900, when Franklin College was closed, the property was vacated. In 1904, Dr. J.P. Roberts opened a children's home there in one of the buildings. Later, the president's of the college's home was used to expand the operation to include a home for unwed mothers. Over a course of 70 years, 7,000 children were born there until it closed in 1974 when cultural values changed. The Rest Cottage was a self-sufficient operation having a dairy, a fruit orchard, chicken hatchery, and many other operations to make it completely self-sufficient.
The railroad came through Pilot Point in 1880, and this is a picture of the first depot and people gathered around it as they wait on a train. It was soon replaced by another depot at the same location, and it served for several years, and then the last depot was built, and it operated until the railroad shut down here in 1959. It was a sad time for us in Pilot Point as we lost the railroad service. So we decided that we'd ride the train out that night, the last train out of Pilot Point, passenger train. And when the train was late getting here, but when it arrived, there was 111 of us that caught the train and rode from Pilot Point to Denton. And the school buses met us there and brought us back to Pilot Point. Here is Dan Gist, president of the Chamber of Commerce, and myself as mayor giving a plaque to service to J.S. Wilson from 1913 to 1959 as a depot agent here in Pilot Point on the day he retired. Just after the present water tower was built in 1916, this picture was taken showing a view of Pilot Point looking to the northeast. You can see the First Baptist Church in the background and out towards where the Catholic Church is. And you might notice all the people that gathered in Pilot Point that traded here at that time. A view from the water tower in 1917, looking north-northwest, shows the livery stable down on the left, far left, then the hotel, next building. The next building, the two-story building, would be the Opera House. And on down the back of the square, you can see the gin, which was the Kimball Gin, which was later replaced, torn down, and built. The city machine shop is located there now. In the right-hand corner, behind the building on the south side of the square, you see the Post Signal building, which was the newspaper at that time. Opera House on the west side of the square, as it operated in the early days of Pilot Point, with the stairway on the left going up. The bottom floor was occupied by a retail store. It was usually a hardware store, but in the latter years, in 1940, the top was taken off, and since that time it was occupied as a hardware store, and later Massey Ford used it for their Ford house, and then David Ford used it continually until he sold out. 1946 view of the Pilot Point Town Square immediately after World War II shows the east side in the background, and in the foreground you notice the Opera House has had the top removed, and it was a retail store, and next to it was a basement from an old building. That was before the Ford house was built there by Lee Massey. View of the Pilot Point Town Square on the east side looking north, probably in the early 1900s, showing the Pilot Point National Bank behind the large tree there, and then in the far background you can see the Woodman of the World Hall. 1907 view from South Washington Street looking north across from the hotel. You can see the hotel lobby on the left, and on the right is the Raglan Drug Store that was situated on the corner. And if you can look closely, you can see the doctor's office and lawyer's office that was in the basement of the drugstore that you entered from the west side from what is now Washington Street. In the background, it shows the Pilot Point Town Square as it was in that day and time. Southwest corner of the square in the late 1920s, showing a Sam Gaynor drugstore, and then the Raglan drugstore, the next building, and across the street you can see the hotel with a balcony out in front, and then showing the Post Signal building on the corner, which is, all of these buildings are still standing, and the building on the corner where the Post Signal was located is now being worked over for a new type cafe or bar. Early view of one of the Autry blacksmith shops and implement dealer. It's located just north of the present water tower in Pilot Point. It was torn down in 1930 and made room for the community building, which was built on that location. View of the Pilot Point Square looking to the southeast immediately after the turn of the century. In the background was the Clore Hotel, and the steeple up above that was the steeple from the Methodist Church as it was situated at that time. East side of the Pilot Point Square in 1905, after all the current buildings were built and located there. Several different businesses on that side. One that was a drugstore, and that remained a drugstore for many, many years, and probably 100 years was a drugstore location on that side. View of the Christian church, present-day Christian church. It was built in 1902, located at the corner of Liberty Street and Church Street, and it's still in operation today. Early day Methodist church constructed in 1884, and it served the community to 1908 when it was torn down and a new church was built. This church had the very high steeple on it that could be seen all around town. The new church was built at the same location, and it was destroyed by fire, hit by lightning in the mid-1980s. Liberty Street looking south down Church Street. On the left you see the Central Christian Church as it stands today. Next on there you can see the Masonic Lodge Hall, which was the first Methodist church that was built in Pilot Point. Next we'd see the Methodist church that was built in 1884 and was torn down in 1908 with the large tower. And further down the street at the corner of Church and Grove, you'd see the steeple to the Presbyterian Church, which was located where David Lewis's house is located now.
The Masonic Lodge building, pictured here, built in 1862. It was used by the Methodist Church and the Baptist Church and other denominations until their buildings were completed. The lodge building continued to stand until the late 1980s when it was torn down after the Methodist Church fire.
George Luber's in the parade of the KC Lodge Convention in 1941. In the background you can see the Catholic Church and also the parsonage for the priest. 1940 revival at the County Line Baptist Church, picnic and dinner on the ground showing the Will Girton family in the foreground. Calvary Baptist Church built in 1908, showing also a picture of the Sunday school class on March 2nd, 1924, Margarita Triplet being the one in the white dress in the front row. The church was destroyed by fire in 1959, but the stained glass windows were saved, and they're in the present-day Calvary Baptist Church. Presbyterian Church, located at Grove and Church Street, served the community for many years. It's located where David Lewis's home is located now. The church later was sold to the Mountain Springs community, and they use it as a community center this day.
In this photo, Rua Beck and Maurice Richards show off their new hearse for the Beck Funeral Home. The funeral home was located just north of the Farmers and Merchants Bank. This photo is from about 1938.
Smith Funeral Home occupied the first 50 foot just east of the Pilot Point National Bank, and now is the City Hall. I worked for Harold Smith and was in the funeral home on duty December the 7th, 1941, when news of Pearl Harbor came over the airways. Ice wagon, it used to make the rounds in Pilot Point, and early 1920s, it had ice cards that you set in your window, 25, 50, 75, or 100 pounds, telling the boys how much ice you needed. After the war, the ice wagon did not run, so you had to go by the ice house and pick up your ice, bring it home and set it in your ice box and use it for cooling your food and for iced tea and things of that nature.
This picture, taken in the late 1890s, shows a typical Saturday afternoon in downtown Pilot Point. It was taken just south of the square at the location of the present Buchanan's restaurant. The 19th Century Club, a federated women's club, was founded in Pilot Point in 1896. This photo shows the founding members around 1910. Looking north on Washington Street from Walcott, you see the tree-lined street with hackberry trees, which were planted in 1916 to 1918. Each tree represented a soldier from Pilot Point who served in World War I. These soldiers that you see here, gathered in front of the Central Christian Church, were on their way to serve their country in around 1918. The 1946 Pilot Point Bearcat football team was one of the best teams the high school has ever produced. Seen here doing their workouts in 1946 at the old field over off Pettigo Street, the 46 Bearcats not only were undefeated, not one opponent scored a single point on them until the 9th game of the season, which they played against Howe. They beat every team with a goose egg. Here is the coaches, Mr. Key, the head coach, and Buster Wood is shown here. John Ed Roberts was also a coach. Some of the stars of this team were Dan Fott, Buddy Burgess, Charlie Cole, and Clem Dunn. along with many others. The team went completely undefeated and went on to win the regional championships at a playoff game against Wilmer Hutchins later on that year. This is on the way to the playoff game with Howe coming through the square, and this is in Howe, Texas, where they played a game which tied 6-6. The girls shown here are Joanne Gibbs and Betty Adams, and the Pilot Point cheerleaders always there to give the team a boost. Many good football teams came out of Pilot Point, winning the state championship under G.A. Moore in 1980 and then again in 1981. Pilot Point has always produced excellent football teams, as football is a tradition that lives in the blood of every boy in Pilot Point. This later view of the west side of the square shows Royce Marshall's cabinet shop behind the pickup truck and George Schindler's pool hall at the end of the block. This photo is from about 1974. To build a large reservoir in North Texas watershed was a dream of Congressman Ray Roberts for many years. His dream was realized when a lake bearing his name was started to be impounded with water in June 30th, 1987, as the gates were closed and Lake Ray Roberts began to fill. Most experts agreed that it would take 7 to 10 years for Lake Ray Roberts to fill, but within 3 years it had not only filled but had also overflowed and onto Highway 377, as you see in this picture from May of 1990. Well, this has been a most enjoyable hour, Clifton. I feel like that I myself have learned a lot about Pilot Point and have really been enjoying discussing it with you today.
Jay, it's been very enjoyable to me too, and I want to show my appreciation and thanks to you for your help since you've been in Pilot Point. And I want to also thank all those that have contributed pictures to me down through the years for part of the history of Pilot Point. And so we'll just remember that we have a great heritage, a great history of town, and we need to continue to try to develop on that history.
Well, it's a great place to spend the day, but I chose to spend the lifetime.